got a potential for a change of government. There is nothing apart from Swan's discussions at an ASFA lunch, and that would be the arena that he'd bring super up. But there's nothing on any of the policies that have been uttered on super.
No, I mean, I just addressed a conference in Europe, which is fundamentally an OECD attended conference, from Italy, France, Germany, looking at our scheme. So we've got, people around the world, and most particularly the Americans, loving to get our scheme. The only thing they've got are those sort of do-it-yourself DIY 401 accounts.
Which have not been a success.
No, and they look at us and say, how did you do it? And yet the party of authorship, the Labor Party, has done nothing about it for 11 years.
It's stagnation. It's interesting that the Blair government, I think, in June this year, are introducing certain elements of the industry funds into their overall scheme. You must be very satisfied with the growth in the industry funds, the way they've grown since inception.
Well, of course, Tony Blair not only pinched that idea, he pinched a lot of other ones. HECS, funding for the arts. He even gave our policy a new name, the Third Way, after we developed it here 15 years earlier.
Yeah.
And I suppose imitation is always the greatest form of flattery, And as Oscar Wilde said, anyone that doesn't like flattery has never been flattered. So we're in Tony's debt. But the industry funds, what I think is solid about them, for a start, they have and had the ring fence of an industry. They have the employer representatives, they have the union representatives as trustees. They've taken good advice from gatekeepers, etc. And they've been able to lower their fees in an environment where professional fund managers were in like Flynn for the big kill. So just as the ACTU was really the leader in getting, Bill Kelty was, the leader in getting housing loan rates down by the deal they first did with National Mutual. Like before that, the housing margin was 300 basis points. Today it's 90. Yep. In the same way as in housing, the industry funds have led the way in getting those fees down. And why shouldn't they? That was going to be in terms of the benefit. I mean, whether if you look at a fund that's earning 5.5% compared to 6.5% or 7 compound, and you're looking at all the world of difference.
Big difference.
Yeah.
But in a world of choice, they're obviously struggling to maintain that difference as the retail funds try to get their funds down, their fees down, and the industry funds, by the very nature of choice, are having to market harder to keep their members. Marketing costs, etc. Yeah. But there's also that again at Wollongong, you brought up another element, the regulation element, and that can be viewed in a number of ways, not just APRA and so on, but also is it the place of government to regulate against fees and commissions that are charged and erode adequacy for ordinary people who pay a trailing 1% or 50 basis point commission on a product that is then billed for the remainder of the product's life? Well, look, it's such a tricky issue, with so many points. This is where I would fall. I used to say to the Labor Party, when it believed in big budget deficits and tariffs and everything else, and industry policy and picking winners, I said, look, what we should be doing is steering the boat, not rowing the boat. And now, largely, this is what happens. Government today steers the boat in Australia, is no longer rowing the boat. We've got out of businesses like Qantas, the Commonwealth Bank. We're not into deficit budgeting to try and get employment off the public sector. We won't tax ordinary people by 100% for the right to buy an Australian motor car, right? In the same way, with superannuation and regulation, I'd say this. Let me give you the financial analogy. When I deregulated the financial system in 1984, removing deposit maturity controls
and lending controls on banks. I let banks themselves decide what deposits they would buy and who they would lend it to.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't sit in there, as we used to do, with quantitative restrictions on lending, as the Reserve Bank in Howard's day and John Stone's day did. But what I said is this: no longer will we have an informal basis of regulation where you get a call up and down Martin Place from the Reserve Bank, how is your book looking now after you've done this deal, that deal and that deal. So I gave them more freedom to lend, more freedom to price their transactions, but a more structured and more rigorous set of prudential controls. Because now super represents such a large proportion of people's savings, I think there is always a greater than a lesser case for prudential supervision of the funds, rather than the regulator trying to second guess what fees and that they should be charging. So in other words, let's steer the boat, not row it. But let's remember that there's a burden of trust here on the system, on trustees from their members. For a large proportion of their savings, they've been prepared to forego as cash and taken as savings. I am no longer in the public sector and I'm no longer doing these things. But anything that says, particularly now with these very large liquidity in the world financial system for a long time, and risk spreads having dropped to sort of almost historic levels, lows. Now is the time to be vigilant about the prudential structure of the funds, and that's what I think the regulator should be.
Yeah. If you were at a starting point today in 2007, not 91 or even 83.
86.
86?
Well, 83 we first changed the tax laws. Yeah, 83, that's right.
But if you're in that position today, would it look any different what you were trying to put in place if there wasn't anything in place? And do you think?
I don't think so.
Would you do something more for women in the workforce than perhaps is available through the current superannuation schemes?
Well, it was a lot of women was one of the things which first encouraged my first change in 83. That was the establishment of approved deposit funds, because often a woman would take out her 15 or 20,000 to leave the workforce to have a family, and they'd go back and it would be spent. They couldn't leave it. There was no vehicle to park it in. So we set up these approved deposit funds so we could get portability and preservation. So we said, look, you've got to preserve this to age 55 then, and we'll let you park it, but you can't take it out. And women were the first beneficiaries of that policy, of course. The circumstance of women in superannuation today has got as much to do with incomes, relative incomes, and negotiating power to get something above the 9%. They all get the 9%, but if they want something above it, they've got to have negotiating ability. So I go back to the first part of your question, would we have done it differently? Well, I guess with the experience I have today, I would have paid more tax cuts as savings than as cash. But in the first place, what I said to the unions and to Bill Kelly and his executive was, you get to 55 or 60% of the workforce with award superannuation for the first 3%, and I'll legislate for the people that couldn't get it. And so I did in 92. I legislated 91, I think, wasn't it? 91, yeah. I legislated to give those people who had nothing the first 3%, and those who had the 3% to take them to 9. So then everybody went to 9. I think probably if we were starting today, we'd still start industrially.
Yeah.
Yep. And a lot of the 9% top-up will happen industrially. Like for instance, if you take the state sector wages, which are going to be market leaders this year, it would be very advantageous for state treasurers to say to public sector unions, look, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll leave a bit in for you if you take more of it as savings than you are prepared to take. And in one, like let's say we're trying to get from 9 to 12% in one 4-year term, one 4-year agreement, we're talking about 0.75% a year. Well, the states could throw in something, and we get there industrially. So I think actually industrially we'll do more to make up. I mean, given that the Liberal Party has been so squarely against working people and the Labor Party's been so hopeless, that doing it industrially, I mean, why wait for those guys to give it to you when they're not going to? You better go out and get it.
Do you think Rudd will focus on super? Will he re-engage?
Well, Kevin's a working class type. I mean, you know, his fidelity to working people is not fraudulent or phony. And if you are faithful to their interests, you must come back to it.
Last October, I saw you speak at Cybos breakfast when you talked about China, and probably gave a lot of people in the room an insight into dealing with China that they hitherto hadn't had, even though they're all bankers.
Yeah.
Do you think that...
well, they're only bankers.
Australia...
They're pretty limited.
They are. Do you think that Australia has a role and almost a responsibility to try and engage with the emerging markets in Asia, including China and even India, although India is probably a different kettle of fish, but particularly Vietnam and so on, in the area of retirement income? They're all recognising they have to confront the fact that they have to do something about retirement income. Our trustee system could be a very valuable asset.
Yeah. Well, I have myself spoken to Chinese officials about our scheme on a number of occasions. The Chinese have got a big problem, of course. They've got now, the demographics of their workforce is quite good for them. But of course, with the one-child policy, a great body of them move into retiring age at the one time. So they'll have to do it privately, or they'll have to do some government-sponsored scheme. The best place to do it in a country like that, where you really don't have the industrial structure we have, or unions as we have them, is really through the tax system. In other words, don't leave national savings on the budget table for some non-spending minister to spend. Take it off and give it to working people and let them save it in their super account, you know. But the other thing, there's a more general point about Australian savings and super and these markets. Developing markets account for about 12% of world stock market capitalisation. But in terms of GDP, emerging markets account for about 36%, which gives you a clue. There's a lot of cheap stock laying around in these markets. It's become less cheap in the last year because prices have come up. But in the end, I think to maintain the growth in wealth which we're going to need in this system, we'll have to access to the emerging markets, the developing markets. The other thing is, of course, when we reach what I call the tipping point, the demographic tipping point, which I think is about 2008 or 9, it's about 2 years away, there'll probably be more net redemptions from superannuation and mutual funds than not. In other words, there'll be a big sell-off of stocks.
Yeah.
That being the case, stock market prices are liable to soften, and particularly with bond yields rising with inflation. If structural inflation is rising, bond yields are rising, and therefore bond prices are falling. If bond prices are falling, stock prices are falling. So if your super fund in Australia has got to make 6.5% or 7%, but the stock market has run into bad weather, then where do you go to keep that rate up? Well, I think you have at least a proportion of it with the emerging markets.
The only issue there is whether or not the emerging markets can provide the same surety around their governance that Australia has become used to in the last 3 or 4 years.
Well, the answer is they won't, but then they'll give you much bigger returns as a consequence.
And you think that will be the compromise?
You don't put all of it there, you park some of it there.
Yeah. Well, there's enough looking for somewhere to be parked now to satisfy that. The issue of corporate governance has really emerged over, 4 or 5 years, but now the burning issue, of course, is social governance and global warming and so on. Australia is one of the second driest continent in the world, country in the world. It doesn't seem to be punching above its weight in doing something about climate change, if indeed anyone should be doing something about climate change.
Well, I don't know. I mean, of course we've got to be doing something about climate change, and if we can, package up the infrastructure projects, super could become a bigger player. And there's no doubt super's already a big player. I mean, Macquarie Bank is a packager for the industry funds and the super funds. Well, that's what these outfits are. I mean, take Champ Private Equity, they're packages for super money. There should be more of this, but I don't know, beyond those, obvious points, what else I can say.
Yeah, I think probably from the investment point of view, there should be more attention on things like solar energy, alternative energies, all those sorts of things. Yeah. And I think that probably IFM, Gary Weedon's mob are doing that with their
That's right, but again, what is the key to wealth? It is asset allocation. And one thing I should hope that our funds have become good at is the question of asset. The trustee structure has become competent about the issue of asset allocation. It is about that.